Ever get the feeling that there's so much about our Catholic faith we kind of take for granted? Like we do things without really knowing where they came from.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to inherit practices without, fully grasping their original meaning or the historical forces that shaped them.
Right. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, some forgotten Catholic traditions. We've got this fascinating book as our guide, Forgotten Catholic Traditions Rediscovered. But we're not just going to list them off, are we?
No, not at all. We're going deeper.
Yeah. The WHY, the meaning for those who practice them, and even what traces, if any, are still around today.
It's amazing what these seemingly lost traditions reveal about how Catholic faith and practice has evolved over time.
I bet. Okay, so to kick things off, let's talk about something that might completely change how you experience Mass. Have you ever heard of fermentum?
Fermentum.
Yeah. Picture this. You're receiving communion, but the bread, that tiny piece, was actually part of the host from the PAP's Mass.
Wow, that's a powerful image. You can really sense that connection to the heart of the church.
It wasn't just about the bread itself, was it? Like, what made that connection so significant, especially way back in the early church?
Well, back then, Christianity was still spreading, facing persecution, so fermentum was a powerful reminder of unity. Every week, the Pope would send pieces of the host to bishops, who then shared them with their priests.
Ah, I see.
It was a visible sign that they were all part of the one body of Christ. Distance, circumstance, it didn't matter.
So it disappeared at some point. Was it like a sudden thing, or did it fade away slowly?
It was gradual. As parishes grew and could have their own masses, that need to share the Eucharist lessened. And there was also this growing emphasis on reverence for the Eucharist. People getting a bit concerned about transporting it over long distances.
Makes sense. So the way we did things changed, and so did the meaning. But wait, didn't you say there's a tiny echo of fermentum still in Mass today?
That's right. It's subtle, but it's there. That tiny piece of the host the priest drops into the chalice during the commingling.
Oh, right, right.
It's a direct link, a kind of a liturgical memory.
Wow, I'm already seeing Mass in a whole new light. It makes you wonder how many other things we miss, right? Speaking of connections, let's shift gears to traditions that really linked faith to the rhythms of nature. Ember and Rogation Days.
Yeah, they show this fascinating connection between religious observance and, well, daily life, especially back then in a more agrarian society.
Okay, paint me a picture. What would it have been like to actually experience those days?
Imagine your entire town processing through the fields, chanting, offering prayers for a good harvest. That was the essence of Rogation Days, asking God's blessing, protection over the crops, the land itself.
Sounds almost medieval.
Yeah.
And how did Ember Days fit in?
So Rogation Days were tied to specific agricultural concerns. Ember Days, though, were more about marking the changing seasons. They happened 4 times a year at the solstices and equinoxes.
Oh, so like spiritual checkpoints throughout the year.
Precisely. Time to pause, give thanks for creation's bounty, do some penance, pray for things like the clergy, new vocations.
Makes sense why that resonated with people back then. Their lives are so intertwined with the natural world. But it's hard to imagine that fitting into our busy urban lives, isn't it?
You're right. As we shifted away from agriculture, the direct connection faded. Plus, the liturgical reforms after Vatican II made them optional, so less and less people observed them.
So not abolished, just sort of faded. It seems like there's a pattern here. Traditions adapting, changing, sometimes disappearing as times change. But I got to ask, is there any value in like revisiting Ember and Rogation Days today?
Maybe. I think there's potential to adapt that core spirit, Rogation Days, that focus on the land, could become prayers for the environment. Ember Days' emphasis on vocations could be a powerful way to encourage discernment.
It's not about clinging to the old ways, but seeing what they can teach us today, right?
Exactly. Even forgotten traditions can offer valuable insights and maybe even help us approach our faith in new ways.
I like that. Okay, let's dive into something a bit more visual. We've talked about how practices evolve, but what about ceremonies, particularly those surrounding the papacy? Did you know popes used to be carried on a throne?
It's true, we're talking about a whole world of ceremonies that have been simplified or even abandoned, but to get it, we've got to step back in time. So picture a papal coronation. What comes to mind?
Honestly, lots of gold, incense, maybe a crown or two, the whole historical image. But I'm sure there's more to it than that.
Oh, there's definitely more. You're right about the grandeur, but it wasn't just for show. Every element was deeply symbolic. Take the tiara, the triple-tiered one. Each tier represented something different about the Pope's authority.
Oh, Like what?
Supreme pastor, supreme teacher, and supreme ruler of the papal states. It was a visual way of communicating power, authority, all that.
Wow, okay. I'm starting to see why things have changed. But wasn't there more to it than the coronation? What about those giant feather fans you see in old photos?
Ugh, the flabella and the sedia gestatoria, the portable throne. It wasn't just for looks, though. Imagine trying to see the Pope through a crowd of thousands.
Yeah, that'd be pretty chaotic.
Exactly. These things helped elevate him, literally and symbolically. He was visible and protected. But as we know, all of that eventually faded away.
What prompted that? Sudden decree from the church or more gradual?
It was gradual for sure. Vatican II played a big part simplifying and modernizing things.
So less about rejecting those practices and more about like aligning them with how the church saw itself in the world.
Exactly. Pope Paul VI, who was really leading this transition, saw it as a way to emphasize the Pope as a pastor, a shepherd, not some distant, untouchable figure.
It's interesting how those small changes in ceremony reflect a bigger change in the church's self-understanding, right? And speaking of things that have changed, let's talk about another practice that might seem strange today, the clerical tonsure and the minor orders.
Those offer a unique look into how the priesthood itself has changed, like how we even get TO ordination.
Okay, full disclosure. I've always wondered about that shaved circle on priests' heads. What was that all about?
It might seem odd now, but the tonsure was a strong symbol, separating someone from the world, a visible mark of their dedication. But it wasn't a solo journey.
Right, you mentioned the minor orders earlier. Remind us how those worked.
Think of it like an apprenticeship, step by step. Each rank had its own duties, symbolism. It started with porter, then lector, the one who read during Mass, then exorcist.
Wait, hold up. Exorcist, like the demon casting kind. That was just part of training.
It was. The roles changed a lot since then, obviously. But back then, it was seen as a necessary skill.
I guess some things never change, huh? But I'm guessing the minor orders have been, well, forgotten.
Yeah, they were suppressed in the Latin Church in 72 as part of the post-Vatican II reforms.
So all those ranks, those rituals, just gone.
Not entirely. Two of them, lector and acolyte, were kept but redefined. Now they're ministries, open to men AD women. The others, like porter and exorcist, those were discontinued. And with them, the tonsure went too.
So even in reforming, there's this element of preserving, but in a new way. It makes you wonder, what was lost? Did something valuable disappear with the outward symbols?
It's a good question. Some people say the modern way is maybe more efficient, but lacks that richness, that symbolism. Others see it as a necessary change.
Seems like every layer we peel back reveals more questions than answers. But that's what makes this so interesting. Makes us think about how history shapes our faith.
It's not about romanticizing the past or clinging to old ways. It's about understanding why things were done, what needs they met.
And maybe rediscover something important about ourselves as Catholics along the way. Okay, let's shift gears again. We talked about official stuff, but what about traditions in everyday Catholic life? If you grew up Catholic, especially a few decades back, you probably saw those brown scapulars everywhere.
Ah, yes, the Brown Scapular and the 9 First Fridays. Those devotions were really central to how people lived their faith, but like so many things, they faded a bit.
It is interesting how something so common can just sort of fade into the background. Let's start with the brown scapular. What's it all about, and why was it so important to people?
It's simple, really. A piece of brown cloth, usually wool, worn over the shoulders. It's about devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and it's got a powerful promise attached. Wear it faithfully, you'll be protected from eternal fire.
Wow. Yeah, I can see the appeal. But you said it's not as common now. Why is that?
It's complicated. Catechesis changed after Vatican II. The focus shifted. Newer generations just weren't as exposed to it.
So it wasn't like the church said it was wrong or anything, just less emphasis.
Right. It's still a valid sacramental, a sacred sign, but not as central.
And hasn't there been some renewed interest in it lately?
There has. It's interesting. Younger Catholics are rediscovering these older traditions. I think they're drawn to the tangible nature of it, a physical reminder of their commitment.
It speaks to that need for something concrete, something beyond just thinking about our faith.
Absolutely.
What about the 9 First Fridays? That was a big one too, right?
Huge. This one's about the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Receiving communion on the first Friday for 9 months straight, with the right intention, of course, and the promise, grace of final perseverance,
Meaning?
assurance of dying in a state of grace.
Wow, powerful stuff. But it seems like that's faded too. Any idea why?
Similar reasons, I think. Catechesis shifted, plus maybe some folks felt it was too formulaic, like do this and God has to do that.
But that's not really the point, is it?
Of course not. These devotions, if you approach them right, are about deepening your relationship with Christ, opening your heart to grace. It's about transformation, not just checking boxes.
It's like they were rediscovering a lost language, a way to connect that goes beyond just words, right?
I love that.
Hmm.
And it points to what we've been talking about. These traditions, they might seem like relics, but they still have something to say to us.
They give us a glimpse into the richness of our faith across different times and places. And they invite us to ask ourselves, what can we take from these traditions? Not in a rigid way, but with a sense of curiosity, openness to what they might teach us.
Exactly. It's about finding those connections between then and now.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already in this deep dive. We've gone from the early church to the present day, explored forgotten practices, ceremonies, even devotions. Before we go any further, though, I'm curious, what stood out to you so far? What's sparking your curiosity?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How even those little changes show a bigger shift in how the church sees itself, its place in the world.
Yeah, it's like tradition isn't this fixed thing. It's always evolving. I'm really curious about those papal ceremonies we talked about. Yeah, so different now, but I want to understand, like, what they meant back then.
They do offer a unique window into a different time. Take the papal coronation. It wasn't just put a crown on it, you know? So much symbolism, so carefully planned. Remember the triple-tiered tiara?
Yeah, the one with the three levels, each one representing a different part of papal authority.
That's it. And placing the tiara on the Pope's head. That was just the end of a whole series of rituals, all emphasizing how important, how weighty the papacy was.
It was like a super visual way of communicating all that, wasn't it? Their power, their authority, it's so different from how we see it now.
Totally different. And it wasn't just the coronation. Think about the sedia gestatoria, the throne they carried him on.
Oh, yeah. That always seemed a bit much to me, like something out of a movie. But you said there was a practical side to it, too.
Oh, for sure. Back then, no microphones, no loudspeakers. Try addressing a huge crowd without some way to be seen. The sedia gestatoria made sure everyone could see him. And those flabella, the fans.
Yeah, those were huge.
Well, they created this sense of movement, grandeur, right? But also, they provided some relief from the heat, the press of people.
It's funny how those things that seem over the top actually had a purpose. But they're all gone now, right?
Well, it was gradual. Pope Paul VI, he was a big part of the change, decided no coronation for him, and he was the last to use the tiara. He slowly fussed out the flabella and the sedia gestatoria too. And then in 78, Pope John Paul II. He walked through the crowds, no more being carried.
It's interesting how those weren't like official orders from the top, more like a shift in thinking, how they approached it.
That's a key point. Tradition isn't about clinging to the past. It's alive, it adapts. Vatican II was a big influence, all that emphasis on simplifying things, modernizing. But it wasn't about erasing the past, more like finding ways to express those core ideas for a new time.
So less about outward displays of authority, more about being a pastor, a shepherd, right?
More humble, accessible.
Makes you realize that even those traditions that seem most set in stone, they change too.
They do, and that's not a bad thing. It's how tradition stays relevant. Speaking of which, let's go back to the clerical tonsure and the minor orders.
Ah, yes. The shaved head, the step-by-step path to priesthood. I gotta admit, the whole exorcist training thing still blows my mind.
Yeah.
So different from how we think about it now.
It is, isn't it? But it shows us something fascinating. For centuries, people just understood that there were spiritual forces, good, A-N-D, evil. The exorcist, maybe not as common now, but back then, a vital part of caring for people.
It reminds us that the church has always dealt with the unseen,
Yeah.
the spiritual side of life. But those minor orders, there was more to it than just exorcism, right?
Oh, way more. It was like this whole training system building up to priesthood. Each step, porter, lector, exorcist, all had meaning and practical stuff to do, shaping not just their knowledge, but their character.
Yeah.
Humility, obedience, service, all that.
So structured, planned out, not like the seminary system we have today. But what happened to all of that? You said it was suppressed after Vatican II.
Yeah, 1972, Latin Church, part of all those liturgical changes.
So was it just gone overnight?
Mm-hmm.
Or did some of it survive?
It's interesting, actually. Two of the minor orders, lector and acolyte, they stuck around but got redefined. Now they're ministries, open to men and women both. But the others, porter, exorcist, those were dropped. And the tonsure went with them.
So even while reforming, They held on to some parts just in a new way. Makes you think, what did we lose? Did some of that richness go away when we lost those symbols?
It's a good question to think about. Some argue that maybe we're more efficient now, but maybe lost something along the way. Others say it was just a necessary change.
Seems like every time we look back, more questions come up. But that's what makes this so engaging, how we understand vocations today, to the priesthood or other ministries. It's all connected to these shifts.
Exactly. And as we keep exploring these traditions, it's important to remember it's not about just holding on to the past. It's about dialogue, learning from what came before, and letting that inform our faith today.
Okay, ready for a change of pace? We've talked about official things, but I want to get into something more personal. Traditions that were just part of daily life. You know, if you grew up Catholic, especially mid-20th century, you probably saw those brown scapulars everywhere.
Yes. The Brown Scapular and the 9 First Fridays. It was like everyone was doing them back then. But like a lot of things, they're not as common now.
It's funny how something so widespread can just fade.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the brown scapular first. Remind us, what's it all about? What made it so important to people?
It's pretty simple, really. A small piece of cloth, brown, usually wool, worn over the shoulders. It's about devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And there's a powerful promise. If you wear it faithfully, you're protected from eternal fire.
Wow, yeah, that's a big one. I can see why people loved it. But you're saying it's less popular now? What happened?
A few things. After Vatican II, how we teach the faith, it changed. Newer generations didn't hear as much about it. Plus, people were looking for a more nuanced understanding of salvation, not just do this, get that, you know.
So it wasn't that the church said it was bad, just less emphasis.
Right. It's still a valid sacramental, it's a sacred sign, but not as central to practice anymore.
But hasn't there been, like, a comeback for the scapular?
There has. Younger Catholics are rediscovering these older traditions.
Oh.
I think they're drawn to the physicality of it, you know?
Yeah.
You wear it, it's a constant reminder of your devotion.
It's that need for something you can touch, something beyond just the ideas.
Exactly.
What about the 9 First Fridays? That was another big one, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, huge. That one's about the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Receive communion on the first Friday of the month, 9 months in a row, with the right intention and the promise, the grace of final perseverance.
So you're guaranteed to die in God's grace.
That's the idea.
Intense. But seems like that one's fallen off too. Any thoughts why?
Partly those catechetical changes, like we said, but also some folks maybe felt it was too, I don't know, transactional, like you're making a deal with God.
But that's not really what it's about, is it?
No, not at all. These devotions, if you do them right, they're about deepening your relationship with Christ, letting God's grace work in you, not just going through the motions.
It's like rediscovering a way to connect that goes beyond words.
Right.
Those physical actions, those commitments.
That's a great way to put it, and it comes back to what we keep seeing, right? These traditions, they might seem old-fashioned, but they still have something to offer us today.
They show us how rich and diverse our faith has been across time.
And they challenge us to look closer, ask ourselves, what can we learn from them? How can they speak to us and now?
Exactly. It's not just about preserving the past, it's about finding that connection between then and now. And who knows, maybe we'll find that those old ways have something valuable to teach us, even in our modern world. Okay, before we move on to our next set of traditions, I'm curious, what's resonating with you so far? Anything sparking your curiosity? It really makes you think, you know. These traditions, even the ones we don't do anymore, they still have something to say to us.
I keep thinking about how many of them are about actually doing something. It's like our faith isn't just in our heads. It's got to be lived out physically, too.
You've hit on something important there. It makes me think about all those physical actions we use to express our faith. Making the sign of the cross, lighting a candle, even receiving communion. There's power in those actions. They connect us to something bigger.
It's like in this world where everything's online, we've lost touch with that, haven't we? That physical side of faith. Maybe that's why people are interested in these older traditions again. They're looking for something real, something they can hold on to. It's like rediscovering a language, a way to talk to God that uses your whole self, not just your mind. And speaking of traditions that connect to the physical realities of life, there's one that might resonate, especially with women. Ever heard of the churching of women?
Churching of women? Can't say I have. Honestly, it sounds a bit old-fashioned. What was it all about?
It was a really beautiful ritual, a blessing for new mothers after childbirth, usually about 40 days after the baby was born. It was a way to acknowledge how sacred motherhood is, thanking God for a safe delivery and recognizing how the mother is renewed spiritually and physically after that experience.
So it was like welcoming her back to the community after everything she went through.
Exactly. And it also had a connection to the purification of Mary, 40 days after Jesus was born. But like you said, it's not something you hear about much anymore.
Why is that? Did people just decide it was out of date, or was there something else going on?
It started fading after Vatican II, partly because people misunderstood it. Some thought it meant women were, like, unclean after childbirth, which obviously doesn't fit with what the church teaches about the dignity of women.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. So it got caught up in all those changes happening in society.
That's part of it. But the churching of women, it was never about being cleansed of sin. It was about recognizing how much changes for the mother spiritually and physically when she gives birth, and offering a special blessing as she starts this new phase of life.
It's a shame it got misunderstood. It sounds like a really beautiful way to acknowledge everything that goes into being a mother. But you said forgotten, not gone completely. Anyone doing it today?
Some traditional communities still do, yeah. And there are some Catholics who are trying to bring it back, not as something from the past, but as a way to support mothers during that postpartum time, which honestly gets overlooked a lot.
I love that. It's such a huge thing, becoming a mother. It deserves to be recognized, celebrated. Maybe this ritual can be a way to do that, give mothers a space to feel seen, supported, blessed as they figure out this whole new life with a baby. It reminds us that tradition isn't just about looking back. It's about finding ways to make that ancient wisdom work for us now.
Exactly. And that's what's been so amazing about this deep dive. We've found so many of these forgotten traditions, each one a little window into the richness of our Catholic faith, how it's been lived out over centuries.
We've covered so much ground. From the early church to today, the Eucharist, papal ceremonies, those personal devotions, it's like peeling back layers of time, rediscovering these treasures that were once such a big part of being Catholic.
And hopefully we've challenged some ideas along the way, sparked some curiosity, maybe even inspired some new ways of thinking about our faith.
Absolutely. It's been a great reminder that tradition isn't stuck in the past. It's alive, it changes, but those core values, they stay strong.
And it's up to each of us, right, to really engage with that tradition, ask the hard questions, figure out what speaks to us, and then find a way to make it real in our own lives.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, as we wrap things up, we want to hear from Wei You. What surprised you? What made you think? And what will you take away from this journey into the forgotten parts of our Catholic heritage? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring.